The wind outside did nothing to cover the sound of a little girl crying behind a locked apartment door, and nobody watching that night could have guessed that the man about to kneel down in front of her mother was worth $11 billion. He was not supposed to be there. He was supposed to be 40 floors up in a glass office, closing a deal that would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. Instead, he was standing in a hallway that smelled like old carpet and rain-soaked coats, holding a paper bag of groceries he had bought himself for the first time in 15 years, waiting for a 7-year-old girl to open a door she had been told never to open for strangers. What happened next would be filmed on a cracked phone screen by a neighbor who just wanted to see what the commotion was about. That video would be watched 40 million times in 9 days. News anchors would replay it in slow motion. Talk show hosts would ask, "Did he really kneel?" And every single time, the answer was yes. But before you find out why one of the richest men in the country dropped his knees in a public hallway in front of his assistant's neighbor, and before you hear the 6 words that little girl said that made grown men in suits cry on live television, you need to understand how far this man had to fall to finally become someone worth kneeling for. If this story moves you even a little, do something for us before we go back. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Give this video a like if you believe kindness still means something in this world. And down in the comments, tell us where you're watching from tonight, because we read every single one, and stories like this deserve to be shared with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's go back. 3 months earlier, on the 52nd floor of a building that touched the clouds, a man named Julian Hart stood at a window that stretched from floor to ceiling, looking down at a city that belonged to him in every way that mattered on paper. He owned 12 buildings in that skyline. He owned the parking garage beneath the coffee shop, where tired nurses bought their morning coffee. He owned the apartment complex where teachers and bus drivers and single mothers paid rent every month without ever knowing his name. He was 44 years old, and he had not smiled in a way that reached his eyes in almost 6 years. People who worked for him described him in careful words. Demanding, precise, cold, if they were being honest, though nobody said that word out loud in the building. His assistant of 4 years, a quiet and fiercely loyal woman named Renee Voss, was the only person who had ever seen him cry, and that had happened exactly once, on an anniversary neither of them ever spoke about afterward. Julian had not always been made of ice. 6 years earlier, he had a wife and a daughter. His daughter was 6 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and a stuffed rabbit she refused to sleep without. On a Tuesday evening that started like any other, his wife was driving their daughter home from a piano lesson when a truck ran a red light. Julian was in a meeting when the call came. He had built an empire that could buy almost anything in this world, and none of it could buy him 5 more minutes with either of them. After that day, Julian Hart built walls instead of buildings. He worked 18-hour days not because he needed the money, but because grief could not find him in a boardroom. He fired people who cried in front of him. He avoided children's birthday parties, elevators with strollers in them, and any street with a piano lesson sign in the window. His company grew larger every year. His heart grew smaller every year to match it. Renee had watched this happen from 6 feet away for 4 years. She had learned to read his silences the way other people read newspapers. She knew which silence meant leave him alone, and which silence meant something inside him was breaking quietly where no one could see it. She had never once tried to fix him, because she understood something most people didn't. You cannot talk a person out of grief. You can only wait nearby until they're ready to feel something again. What Julian did not know, because he never asked his assistant a single personal question in 4 years of working together, was that Renee went home every night to an apartment complex 2 neighborhoods away from her own, not because she lived there, but because a woman in that building needed help, and Renee had quietly decided to be the kind of person who gives it. The woman's name was Claire Bennett. She was 31 years old, and she worked 2 jobs, one at a diner during the day and one cleaning offices at night, so that her daughter would never have to know how close they sometimes came to not having enough. Claire's husband had died 4 years earlier in a construction accident on a site owned, though she never knew it, by a company that eventually became one of Julian Hart's smaller holdings, bought and folded into his empire 2 years after the accident happened, in a deal Julian had approved with a single signature and never once read the details of. Claire's daughter was named Hope. She was 7 years old, with 2 missing front teeth and a habit of asking questions that made adults stop in their tracks. Hope did not know her family was one missed paycheck away from losing their apartment. She did not know her mother sometimes skipped dinner, so there would be enough for breakfast the next morning. What Hope knew was that her mother always tucked her in, always kissed her forehead twice, once for good night, and once for I love you, and always said the same thing before turning off the light. We don't have much, but we have enough, because we have each other. Renee had met Claire 8 months earlier in the worst possible way, standing beside her in a grocery store checkout line, when Claire's card was declined for the 3rd time, and a little girl behind her started to cry from embarrassment. She was too young to understand. Renee had quietly paid for groceries and walked away before Claire could even say thank you. 2 days later, she found out by accident that Claire lived 1 floor below her sister, in the same complex Renee sometimes visited, and from that day forward, Renee began showing up, not with charity that embarrassed anyone, just with small things. A bag of extra groceries she claimed she bought too much of, an old coat that didn't fit her anymore, a few hours of free babysitting, so Claire could pick up an extra shift. Julian noticed none of this, because Julian noticed almost nothing outside the 4 walls of his office, until the day Renee made a mistake. It was a Thursday, and Julian was preparing for the most important meeting of the quarter, a decision that would determine whether his company demolished an aging apartment complex to build luxury condos or renovated it and kept rent affordable for the families who lived there. The complex was, though Julian did not yet know it, the very building where Claire and Hope lived. Renee was supposed to have the final report ready by 9 in the morning. At 8:55, she was still not at her desk. Julian called her 3 times. She did not answer. When she finally rushed in 20 minutes late, her eyes were red, her blouse had a small tear at the shoulder, and she was holding nothing, no folder, no laptop, no report. For the first time in 4 years, Julian raised his voice at her in front of the entire office. He asked her where the report was. She said she was sorry, that something had happened, that she needed 5 minutes to explain. He did not give her 5 minutes. He told her, in front of 12 other employees, that if she could not separate her personal life from her job, she was in the wrong career. He told her that everyone in this building had problems, and everyone in this building still managed to show up on time. He told her that loyalty without reliability was worthless to him. Renee stood there and took every word without arguing, which somehow made it worse for everyone watching, because it meant she believed she deserved it. What Julian did not know, because he never once stopped talking long enough to ask, was that Renee had spent the previous night sitting on the floor of a hospital hallway with Claire, holding her hand while doctors checked Hope for a fever that had spiked to a frightening number after school. What he did not know was that Renee had used her own rent money to cover the emergency room copay because Claire's card had been declined again. What he did not know was that the tear in her blouse happened when a nurse's cart clipped her shoulder as she ran down the hallway, trying to find a doctor who would see a 7-year-old faster. She went home that night, closed her apartment door, sat down on the floor with her back against it, and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years. The next morning, she did not quit. She did not explain herself. She simply went back to work, because rent was rent and Claire and Hope needed her to still have a job that let her help. But something in Julian's heart, some small crack he did not yet understand, had opened the moment he watched her walk back into that office looking like she had aged 5 years overnight and said nothing in her own defense. He started watching her more closely after that, not because he felt guilty, though somewhere underneath the ice he did, but because for the first time in years, something outside of grief and business had caught his attention. He noticed she left the office at exactly 6 every evening, without fail, even when there was more work to do. He noticed she sometimes carried a second bag with her, not a purse, something heavier. He noticed the way her phone buzzed constantly around dinner time, and the way she would step away to answer in the hallway, speaking in a voice too soft for him to catch the words. One evening, 3 weeks after the meeting where he had humiliated her in front of the office, Julian stayed late working to the renovation versus demolition decision for the apartment complex. He told himself he stayed to review numbers. The truth, though he would not have admitted it that night, was that he was avoiding an empty penthouse that felt louder in its silence with every passing year. at 8 o'clock, needing a signature on an urgent document. He called Renee's cell phone. She answered on the second ring, but the background noise surprised him. A child's laughter, the clatter of dishes, a woman's voice in the distance, saying something about bath time. He asked where she was. She hesitated just long enough for him to notice, then told him the truth for the first time in 4 years. She was at a friend's apartment, a single mother, helping her get her daughter ready for bed because the mother had a late shift and no one else to watch her. Julian, who had not asked a personal question of anyone in years, surprised himself by asking the friend's name. Renee told him, Claire Bennett. He asked, almost without meaning to, where she lived. Renee gave him the address without thinking twice about it, because it never once crossed her mind that her billionaire boss, who barely remembered what floor the break room was on, would do anything with an address. He wrote it down on a sticky note and set it on his desk. He told himself it was because the address sounded familiar, connected to a building his company was reviewing. He told himself it had nothing to do with the sound of a child laughing through a phone speaker, a sound he had not let himself hear in 6 years without leaving the room. That night, for the first time since the accident, Julian Hart did not go straight home. He drove, alone without a driver, without telling anyone, to a neighborhood he had never once set foot in despite owning 3 buildings on that very block. He parked across the street from an apartment complex with peeling paint and a broken light over the entrance, and he sat in his car for 40 minutes, staring up at a window on the 3rd floor where the lights were still on. He did not go inside that night. He told himself it was because it was late, because it would be strange, because a man like him did not simply show up at a stranger's door. The truth, buried somewhere he had not visited in years, was that he was afraid, not of Claire Bennett, of what it might feel like to be near a child again. He drove home in silence and did not sleep. The next morning, he called an assistant in his research department, not Renee, and asked for a quiet background report on the tenants of that apartment building, framed as due diligence for the renovation decision. 2 days later, the report landed on his desk. Most of it was numbers, rent rolls, lease terms, maintenance costs. But tucked into a section about tenant hardship cases was a name that stopped him cold. Claire Bennett, Unit 3C, widow, 1 dependent daughter, age 7, employment, 2 part-time positions, insufficient combined income to reliably meet obligations without third-party assistance, husband deceased, workplace accident for years prior, employer at time of death, a subcontractor later acquired by Hart Industries. Julian read that last line 4 times. His company had not caused the accident directly. The report made that clear. But his company had acquired the subcontractor 2 years later, in a deal meant to consolidate smaller labor firms under his umbrella, a deal he had approved from a spreadsheet without ever learning a single name of the men who worked under that old company's banner. Somewhere in that spreadsheet, invisible to him at the time, had been a husband and a father whose absence was still being felt every single night in apartment 3C. He sat at his desk for a long time after reading that report, the city glittering outside his window, and for the first time in 6 years, Julian Hart felt something crack open in his chest that was not grief for his own family, but something new, something that felt uncomfortably close to responsibility. He did not tell Renee what he had found. He did not tell anyone. Instead, 3 days later, on a Saturday, wearing a plain gray jacket instead of one of his tailored suits, carrying a paper bag of groceries he had bought himself at a store he had never once entered before that afternoon, Julian Hart walked up 3 flights of stairs in a building he owned and knocked on a door that belonged to a family he had never met, but was somehow already tied in ways none of them yet understood. Renee opened the door. The shock on her face lasted a full 3 seconds before she remembered to speak. She had not told Claire who her boss was. She had certainly never imagined he would show up at this apartment on a Saturday, holding groceries, looking like a man trying very hard not to look like himself. Before either of them could say anything, a small voice came from behind Renee's legs. "Who is that?" Hope Bennett stood in the doorway in mismatched socks, one purple, one striped, staring up at the stranger with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only children still had permission to feel. She did not see a billionaire. She did not see her mother's boss's boss. She saw a tall man holding a bag of groceries, standing very still, Looking at her the way you look at something you're afraid might disappear if you move too fast. Julian opened his mouth to introduce himself with some careful, professional excuse about the renovation project, about due diligence, about anything that would explain why he was standing in this hallway. But the words that came out surprised even him. "I brought apples," he said. "I didn't know if you liked apples." Hope tilted her head. "I like apples if they're the red kind, not the green kind. Green kind are sour. These are red," Julian said, and for the first time in 6 years, something in his chest loosened just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long, finally allowing a little slack. Claire appeared behind her daughter a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, confusion and caution both written across her face at the sight of a stranger in an expensive jacket standing in her doorway. Renee quickly stepped in, explaining in a rush that this was her boss, that he was reviewing the building for company, that he must have wanted to see the units firsthand, a lie she constructed on the spot to protect everyone in that moment from a truth too complicated to explain in a hallway. Claire's guard did not fully drop, but something in her posture shifted when she saw the way her daughter had already claimed a bag of apples and was digging through it with both hands, chattering about how she wanted to make apple slices with peanut butter for a snack, the way her mommy always made them. Julian was invited in, more out of politeness than warmth, and he sat at a small kitchen table with a wobbly leg, in an apartment smaller than his own walk-in closet, and for the first time since the accident that took his family, he watched the child eat apple slices across the table from him and did not leave the room. Hope asked him questions the way children do, without any social filter, to soften them. She asked if he had kids. The room went quiet for half a second too long. He said very simply that he used to. Hope, without missing a beat, the way only a child can, said, "Where did they go?" Claire started to apologize, started to tell her daughter that wasn't polite to ask, but Julian held up a hand, gently, and answered the little girl honestly, in words simpler than he had ever used to explain it to another adult. "They went to heaven," he said, "a few years ago. My daughter was about your age." Hope considered this with the seriousness only a 7-year-old could bring to such a sentence, then said, "My daddy's there too. Mommy says he watches us from the stars, so I wave at the sky sometimes in case he can see me." Julian did not trust his voice for a moment. When he finally spoke, it came out rougher than he intended. "That's a good thing to do," he said. "I bet he sees you." Something passed between the man and the little girl in that moment. Something neither of them could have explained. A recognition of shared loss that did not need adult words to be understood. Claire, watching from the counter, felt her own eyes sting, and Renee, standing quietly by the door, understood that she was witnessing something she had never expected to see. Her boss, the coldest man she had ever worked for, sitting in a cramped kitchen, being gently undone by a 7-year-old girl and a bag of red apples. Julian left that evening without explaining who he really was. He told Claire it was nice to meet her, thanked her for the coffee she'd offered, and walked down 3 flights of stairs into the cold night air, feeling like a man who had just remembered, after 6 long years, what it felt like to have a heartbeat that wasn't just keeping him alive, but reminding him he was still capable of feeling something other than grief. He did not sleep that night either, but for a different reason than usual. Over the following weeks, Julian found reasons to return. He told himself each time it was for the renovation review that he needed more information about tenant needs before making a final decision on the building's future. Renee, who was no fool, began to understand what was actually happening, though she said nothing, simply watching as her boss slowly began arriving to work a few minutes later some mornings, his eyes a little less hollow, his voice a little less sharp with the junior staff. Julian learned things about Claire in those weeks that no report could have told him. He learned she used to want to be a nurse before life required her to take whatever jobs would pay fastest after her husband died. He learned she still kept his old work boots by the door, not because she was waiting for him to walk through it again, but because Hope liked to see them there, liked to believe some part of her father was still standing guard over their home. He learned that Claire never once complained about her circumstances, not to him, not to Renee, not even, as far as anyone could tell, to herself in the quiet moments when no one else was watching. He learned about Hope, too, that she wanted to be an astronaut, because if she could get high enough into the sky, she reasoned, she might get close enough to wave at her father properly. that she had a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, given to her by her father before he died, which she still slept with every night. That detail, when Julian first heard it, nearly broke him in half, because somewhere in a box he had never been able to open, packed away in a storage unit, he paid a company to maintain and never visited, sat his own daughter's stuffed rabbit, missing the exact same ear, chewed off by their old family dog when she was a baby. He did not tell Hope about that. He was not ready to. But that night, for first time in 6 years, he drove to the storage facility, stood in front of Unit 214 for nearly an hour without unlocking it, and finally, with hands that shook more than he expected, opened the door and stepped inside. Meanwhile, the business side of Julian's life had not paused simply because his heart had begun to thaw. The board of Hart Industries was pressing him for a decision on the apartment complex. Demolition would clear the way for luxury condominiums projected to generate 4 times the current revenue. Renovation would preserve affordable housing for hundreds of families, including Claire and Hope, but would cost significantly more and generate far less profit over the next decade. The board meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning. Julian's chief financial officer, a sharp and ambitious man named Grant Alden, had spent weeks building a case for demolition, complete with projections, comparisons, and a persuasive argument that sentimentality had no place in a boardroom. Grant had noticed Julian's recent late arrivals, his distraction, his uncharacteristic softness in meetings, and he did not like what it might mean for the demolition vote. 2 days before the board meeting, Grant did something Julian would not learn about until much later. He quietly contacted the building's property management company and had eviction notices drafted for units behind on any portion of their rent, including apartment 3C, which was due to a medical bill from Hope's hospital visit weeks earlier, 11 days late on a partial payment for the first time in Claire's 4 years as a tenant. Grant framed it internally as standard procedure, tightening loose accounts before a major ownership transition. But the timing was no accident. He wanted Julian distracted by nothing but the deal. The eviction notice was slipped under Claire's door on a Wednesday evening while she was at her night shift, and it was Hope who found it first, sitting on the floor in her socks doing homework, and Hope who picked it up, unable to read all the words, but recognizing the word eviction. From a similar notice a neighbor down the hall had once shown her mother, crying months earlier. By the time Claire came home past midnight, exhausted and aching, she found her daughter still awake, sitting up in bed, holding the folded notice in both hands, quietly asking her mother if they were going to have to live in the car again like the time right after Daddy died. Claire read the notice standing in her kitchen at 1 a.m, and for the first time in 4 years of holding everything together with nothing but sheer will and love for her daughter, something in her finally gave way. She sat down on the kitchen floor, the same floor where she'd once fed Hope her first solid food, and she cried in a way she had never allowed her daughter to witness, quiet, exhausted sob that came from 4 years of carrying a weight alone. Hope, small and barefoot, came out of her room and sat down beside her mother on the floor without a word, wrapping both arms around her, the way children do when they don't understand the problem but understand the pain, and said the words Claire would remember for the rest of her life. "It's okay, Mommy. We still have each other. That's what you always say. That's enough, right?" Claire held her daughter and could not answer for a long time, because for the first time, she was terrified it might not be. Renee found out about the eviction notice the next morning, when Claire called her in tears before her shift, voice shaking too hard to fully explain what had happened. Renee left work immediately without telling Julian why, drove straight to the apartment, and sat with Claire for 2 hours, holding her hand, promising her they would figure something out, though privately, Renee had no idea how. When Renee finally returned to the office that afternoon, pale and quiet, Julian noticed immediately. He asked what was wrong. For the first time, Renee did not hold back. She told him everything, not just about the eviction notice, but about the last 8 months, about the grocery store, about the late nights, about the hospital visit, about Hope's fever and the copay Renee had covered with her own rent money, about the reason she had been late that terrible Thursday morning 3 months earlier when it humiliated her in front of the entire office for a report that had, in that moment, felt like the least important thing in the world. Julian sat in silence through all of it, and when Renee finished, her eyes wet, her hands trembling slightly with the effort of finally saying words she had swallowed for months, he did not apologize the way she expected. He simply asked one question. Why didn't you tell me any of this sooner? Renee's answer landed harder than she intended. Because you never once, in 4 years, asked me a single question about my own life. I didn't think you'd care. The word sat in the room like something physical. Julian did not argue with her. He knew, in that moment, that she was right, and that the man she was describing, the man he had been for 6 long years, was exactly the kind of man who would let an eviction notice slide under a grieving family's door without ever knowing their names. He picked up his phone immediately and called the property management company. He learned within minutes that the eviction notices had gone out to 11 units, all authorized under his company's name by Grant Alden 2 days earlier. He learned that the vote to approve demolition of the building was scheduled for the following morning, a vote that would displace not just Claire and Hope, but every family Renee had come to know in that building over the past 8 months. For the first time in years, Julian Hart felt something other than grief drive him. He felt anger, focused and clean, the kind that comes from finally understanding exactly what needs to be fixed. He canceled every meeting on his calendar for the rest of the day. He called Grant Alden into his office and, in a conversation that later became legend among the staff who overheard raised voices through the closed door, told him in no uncertain terms that the eviction notices were being rescinded immediately, every single one, and that if Grant ever again made a decision that affected a single tenant's life without Julian's direct knowledge and approval, he would no longer have a position at Hart Industries. Grant, stunned, tried to argue the numbers, tried to remind Julian of shareholder expectations, tried to explain that sentiment had no place in business decisions of the scale. Julian's response was quiet, but it carried a weight none of his employees had ever heard from him before. "There's a little girl in that building," he said, "who still waves at the sky because she believes her father can see her from heaven. I am not going to be the reason she loses the only home she has left of him. Find me a way to renovate that building without demolishing a single family's life, or I will find someone who can." Grant left the office without another word. That evening, Julian did something he had not done in 6 years. He personally visited every unit in the building slated for eviction, accompanied by Renee, going door to door, apologizing directly to each family, explaining that the notices had been an error that would never happen again, and that the building would be renovated, not demolished, with every current tenant guaranteed the right to stay at their current rent for no less than 5 years. When they reached apartment 3C, Claire opened the door with red, exhausted eyes, clearly expecting more bad news. Instead, she found her boss's boss standing in the hallway beside Renee, holding the rescinded eviction notice in his hand, and Hope peeking out from behind her mother's legs, having already recognized the man from the apples weeks earlier. Julian knelt down that night for the first time, though not yet the moment that would make headlines. He knelt to Hope's height in the doorway and told her, gently, that her home was safe, that no one was going to make her move, and that if she ever wanted to talk about her dad, or about waving at the sky, he would understand better than most people she'd ever meet. Hope, without hesitation, wrapped her small arms around his neck in a hug he had not expected and had no idea how badly he needed. Over her shoulder, he caught Claire's eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, she was not looking at him with caution or suspicion. She was looking at him the way you look at someone who has just proven, with actions instead of words, that they meant every promise they made. That should have been the end of the hardest part of the story. It was not. Word of Julian's decision to renovate rather than demolish spread quickly through the company, and while most employees admired it, it caused a fracture on the board of directors that Julian had not fully anticipated. 2 weeks later, at the quarterly shareholder meeting, Grant Alden, still bitter over the confrontation and quietly building support among board members concerned about the company's profit margins, made a motion that stunned the room. He proposed a vote of no confidence in Julian's leadership, citing what he called erratic and emotionally driven decision-making that put shareholder value at risk. The vote would take place in 3 weeks. If it passed, Julian would be removed as CEO of the very company he had built from nothing after his family's death, the company that had, in its own strange way, been the only thing keeping him upright for 6 years. Julian told no one outside his closest circle about the vote, not wanting Claire or Hope to feel responsible for the storm building around them. But Renee knew, and Renee, for the first time in her professional life, chose loyalty over caution. She began quietly reaching out to other executives, reminding them of decisions Julian had made over the years that had protected employees, reminding them of the human costs hiding behind every spreadsheet Grant Alden had ever presented. It was a risk that could have cost her career if it failed. 3 days before the vote, a local news reporter doing an unrelated story on rising rents in the city stumbled onto the story of a tech billionaire personally halting an eviction for 11 families in one of his own buildings. The reporter reached out to Claire for comment, having gotten her name from a tenant down the hall. Claire, uncertain and cautious, agreed to a short interview, mostly to explain how grateful her community was, never expecting the story to travel further than the local evening broadcast. But it did travel, because during that interview, 7-year-old Hope, sitting on her mother's lap, uninvited and unprompted, leaned toward the reporter's microphone and said the 6 words that would end up on every major news outlet within 48 hours. He's not rich. He's just kind. The clip went viral overnight. News anchors across the country replayed it the following morning, debating what it meant for a child to draw that distinction, unprompted, unrehearsed, and utterly without agenda. Op-eds were written. Talk shows discussed it. The video accumulated millions of views within days, and buried in the comments beneath nearly every share was some version of the same sentiment. This is what leadership should look like. The board vote, scheduled for that Friday, suddenly carried a weight none of Julian's opponents had anticipated. Removing a CEO who had just become the face of a viral moment about kindness and corporate responsibility was no longer simply a financial decision. It was a public relations catastrophe waiting to happen, and Grant Alden knew it. On the morning of the vote, Grant withdrew his motion before it ever reached the floor, citing, in careful corporate language, a desire to align with the evolving values of the company's stakeholders. Julian remained CEO. Grant resigned 2 months later, taking a position at a rival firm, though several board members privately admitted afterward that the writing had been on the wall the moment that video reached 40 million views. But the story does not end with a boardroom victory, because money and headlines were never what this story was truly about. 3 weeks after Hope's interview aired, Hart Industries hosted its annual community appreciation event, a gala normally reserved for donors, city officials, and business partners, held in the grand ballroom of one of Julian's own hotels. This year, for the first time in the company's history, Julian insisted the guest list include every tenant from the building whose eviction he had personally reversed. Claire almost didn't go. She had no formal dress, no experience in rooms like that, and a lifetime of feeling like spaces filled with chandeliers and marble floors were not built for people like her. It was Renee who convinced her, gently, that she belonged there as much as anyone in that room, perhaps more. The gala was filled with photographers, reporters, and city officials, all drawn there partly by curiosity about the man behind the viral video. Julian, uncomfortable in the spotlight as he always was, moved through the crowd with practiced politeness until he saw Claire and Hope arrive. Hope in a small blue dress with her hair in 2 uneven braids Claire had done herself in their tiny bathroom mirror that afternoon. What happened next was not planned. There was no script, no PR team orchestrating a moment for cameras. Julian simply crossed a room, in front of city council members and journalists, and men worth almost as much as he was, and knelt down in front of Claire Bennett, right there on the marble floor of that grand ballroom, in front of everyone. The room went quiet. Phones came up. A local reporter's camera, and then a nearby guest phone, captured what followed, footage that would be replayed on national television within 24 hours. Julian, still kneeling, did not propose marriage, though the tabloids would speculate wildly about that in the following days. He was not asking for anything. He was giving something. He told Claire, in a voice that carried clearly through the silent room, that 4 years ago, a decision made by his company, one he had never personally reviewed, one he had signed off on without ever learning a single name behind it, had contributed to circumstances that took her husband from her and Hope. He told her he could not undo that. No amount of money, no gesture, no apology could give Hope her father back or give Claire back the 4 years of struggle she had carried largely alone. But he told her that from that day forward, a foundation would be established in her husband's name, funding scholarships, emergency medical assistance, and housing security for families of workers across every company under Hart Industries, so that no other family would ever again fall for the same cracks as had. He then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn object that made Claire's hand fly to her mouth. A stuffed rabbit, missing one ear, its fur faded with age. Not Hope's rabbit, his own daughter's. The one he had finally been able to hold again after opening that storage unit weeks earlier. He held it out not to Claire, but to Hope, kneeling now at her height instead of her mother's, and told her that this rabbit had belonged to his daughter, who was about her age when she went to heaven, and that his daughter had loved this rabbit more than anything else in the world. He told Hope he thought maybe the two rabbits, missing their matching ears, should finally meet each other, and that he thought his daughter would have wanted a little girl who waved at the sky every day to have it. Hope, without a single hesitation, took the rabbit in both hands, hugged it to her chest, and then wrapped her arms around Julian's neck in the same fierce hug she had given him weeks earlier in a hallway that smelled of old carpet and rain-soaked coats. Over her small shoulder, Julian looked up at Claire, and for the first time in 6 years, allowed himself, in front of a room full of strangers and cameras, to cry without shame. Claire knelt down too, joining them both on that marble floor, and the three of them stayed there for a long moment, while a room full of powerful, wealthy, important people stood in complete silence, many of them wiping their own eyes, because they were witnessing something money could never buy and headlines could never fully capture, a man who had lost everything, finally choosing to let himself be found again by a family who had lost almost everything too. The video of that moment reached over 60 million views within a week. News outlets across the country debated its meaning for days. Some called it a corporate spin. Most called it the most genuine thing they had seen from a public figure in years. But the only opinion that ever mattered to Julian Hart came a few nights later, when Hope, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the apartment that would never again receive an eviction notice, looked up at him during a quiet evening of takeout dinner and homework help, and asked him a question so simple and so enormous that Claire, watching from the kitchen, had to set down the dish towel in her hands and hold her breath. "Are you going to stay this time?" Julian did not answer right away. He thought about 6 years of empty penthouses and silent anniversaries. He thought about a boardroom that had nearly cost him everything he had left. He thought about 2 stuffed rabbits, missing matching ears, now sitting side by side on a little girl's bed. And he thought about the fact that for the first time since he lost his own family, he had somewhere he wanted to be at the end of every single day that was not an office with a view of a city he owned, but had never once let himself live in. "Yes," he said, and he meant it more completely than he had meant almost anything in his entire life. "I'm staying." Outside the window of that small apartment, the sky was clear that night. No clouds, no rain, just an ordinary evening sky over an ordinary city street. And somewhere up there, a little girl believed her father was watching, still keeping guard over a home he could no longer stand in, but had somehow, in the strangest and most unexpected way, helped lead a broken man back to. If this story touched something in you tonight, that's exactly why we tell them. Make sure you're subscribed so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still changes everything. And leave a comment telling us the moment in this story that hit you hardest, because every single story we tell is for you.